Our next task is to evaluate the evidence that we have considered for what we're calling the effect heuristic following Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues. Now, as this is the first time that you're in the position of evaluating some evidence on this course, I'm going to go through the process slowly in order to illustrate how it's done. But for the rest of the course, I'm simply going to give you pointers to what I think is good evidence and leave the evaluation to you, because that's actually a significant part of the work that you're doing on this course, evaluating the evidence and coming to conclusions about whether it really supports a hypothesis or perhaps only seems to support a hypothesis. So where are we? We're asking this question. You know what the question is. It's what adults compute that enables them to track moral attributes when they're relying on moral intuitions. And the hypothesis we're working with is that in tracking moral attributes in their moral intuitions, they are computing how acts make them feel. It's by computing how acts make them feel that they are tracking moral properties. How does that work? Very simple idea. They're set up in such a way that in a limited but useful range of cases, morally bad acts make them feel bad, morally good acts make them feel good, so their feelings track the moral attribute. They can therefore rely on their feelings in coming to conclusions about the moral attribute. Same thing, of course, with toxicity and whether something would be good or bad to eat. But is that hypothesis true? That's what we want to know. It's an attractive idea. I think it's a very neat idea, and it's important because it allows us to connect the two major things in moral psychology, the moral intuitions on the one hand and the emotions on the other. That's what moral psychology is mainly about. So it's a very neat idea, but is it true? Well, what we've said so far is that we gather evidence for the hypothesis by looking at its predictions and then testing them. And one prediction of the hypothesis, as you know, is this: if you make people feel bad without them realizing it, they'll be more inclined to judge that something is morally wrong. That's the prediction. And the evidence that I offered you, or what I'm suggesting is evidence, is a study by Schnell and colleagues in which they did indeed make people feel bad. They induced disgust with a variety of tools, including getting them to watch a clip of a disgusting toilet or somebody using a disgusting toilet, in fact reaching into it. I do hope you watch that clip from Trainspotting if you haven't seen it already. So they make people feel disgusting, they manipulate their disgust, and then they test their moral judgments. So we say that Schnell et al. Is evidence for the prediction, and having confirmed the prediction, we then have more reason to accept the hypothesis. But is that right? Is that right? Well, there are two things that we should do here. The first thing that we should do is check whether or not the evidence is really evidence. Is this study really evidence? And in order to answer that question, we need to ask three further questions. Now, the first of those questions is whether this study is being replicated. Has Schnell et al. 2008 been replicated? And the answer is no. As far as I know, that study has not been replicated. But that's okay, that's absolutely fine. So I'm going to give this a tick. Why is that fine? Because when studies have been replicated and the replication was unsuccessful, we then need to abandon them. So to my mind, it's not necessary that a study be replicated before we accept it, but it is necessary that if a study has been replicated and the replication failed, then we should reject it. And indeed, another study by many of the same authors as Schnell et al. 2008 from the same year was subject to a replication attempt, and that attempt failed. And so you'll notice in this course that I'm not talking about that study at all. I shouldn't be talking about that study at all because it didn't replicate. So that's the idea. I note that many researchers, particularly philosophers, still cite famous studies from the 70s or 80s, although those studies have been undeniably subject to failed replication attempts. Don't be those philosophers. Don't be those philosophers. Don't rely on studies where actually we as a scientific community know that the findings are not replicable. Don't rely on those studies. Be more careful. So the first thing we're doing is we're looking for any replication attempts, and we're not worried if we don't find them, but we are worried if we find them and they were unsuccessful. The next question, question 2, is are there any similar studies, and if so, are the findings convergent? So I have a quick look. I use Google Scholar here, just use related articles and cited articles. That'll usually find me something pretty quickly here. And I find a study from Eskeen and colleagues from 2011. And what they did was very interesting. So they used a series of vignettes about things which were perhaps morally questionable, like, for example, two cousins having consensual sex. Many people think that's wrong. And they asked them to make moral judgments about these various vignettes using a standard series of vignettes. The difference was, though, that they manipulated how disgusted people felt by either giving them a drink which was very bitter, or just water, or a sweet drink. And what they found, you can't really see this in the chart's just an illustration, what they found is that there was an interaction between the drink and the moral judgments. So the manipulation, giving people different things to drink, did influence how strongly they condemned actions. And in particular, the bitter drink had a significant effect compared to the water or the sweet in causing people to be harsher in their moral judgments. But the water and the sweet in this study weren't different. There was no sign here that they were different. So I say here we have a study which points in the same direction as Schnall et al. It uses a different method, a different kind of manipulation, and different materials, but it produces broadly the same result. So that's a very encouraging thought here. Why am I asking this question then? Question 2, I give myself a tick here. I'm asking it because I don't like to rely on a single study. A single study may well turn out to be highly replicable, but it could be that it's a kind of a one-off thing, right? It's something really specific to the materials used or something else. So what I do find important is that I'm not relying whenever possible on a single study. I want to have a family of studies that vary the materials, methods, and ideally come from different labs and perhaps even different countries if I can get them. I want to go as broad as possible. So that was the second question. Here's the third question. Has the study featured in a review? And if so, does the review broadly support the findings of the study? Now here, I don't think I would abandon the study if that wasn't the case, but this is reassuring. Some other expert has reviewed this study and some other studies and found that the study broadly does what the authors of the study say it does. And that is, of course, very reassuring and very encouraging, because these scientists, you know, they're not entirely to be trusted. They're not entirely to be trusted. We have to approach them with an interesting degree of skepticism, as outsiders, as people who can be easily misled. So there is a summary, a review paper from Chapman and Anderson, published in 2013, and I'm just showing you a table from that study. I don't think you can read it in the slides, but do go away and look at it afterwards if you're interested. So Chapman and Anderson considered 11 studies, I think it was 11, and what they found is that in 9 of those studies there was a significant effect of feelings or emotions on moral judgments. 2 of the studies didn't find such an effect, but of course that isn't evidence that the effect is absent. So the absence of finding an effect, no evidence, doesn't tell us that the effect isn't there. It just tells us that either the effect wasn't there in those cases, or the studies were badly designed. They weren't sensitive enough to discover the effect. So this is quite a good result for us. The review paper says that there are a wide range of studies which support the basic idea of Schnall et al. 2008. Here's a quote from the authors to that effect, in case you don't believe me. I won't read that out because I've put it in the notes that you'll see right below this recording. So you can just go and have a read of that. You can even copy and paste it from my notes if you'd like to. But I think it's clear that Chapman and Anderson are reviewing Schnall et al. 2008 and supporting their findings. Great. Okay, so that's a good result for us. By the way, here's an aside. While we're on Chapman, so Hannah Chapman, a brilliant researcher, very interesting. I just wanted to point out as an aside that she's done something that nicely complements what Schnall and colleagues have done. What she and her team did back in 2009 was to manipulate morality and measure feelings of disgust. So they gave people passages which had either ethical bad or were in some way kind of like disgusting foods or other things. And what they found, which was quite interesting, is that you get signs of disgust, neurophysiological as well as facial signs of disgust they measured, when you manipulate morality, not just when you manipulate something which is disgusting in the way of food, right? Disgusting in the way that poo is disgusting. So I thought this is really interesting because you get this nice complementary effect here. That's quite informative. But that's an aside because it's not for us, for now, the main concern that we have. It does look like, though, that there's this two-way causal connection between emotions or feelings and ethical intuitions on the other hand. All right, so where are we? We're asking about Schnall et al. And the third thing we have to do to see whether or not what they have provided counts for us as evidence is to see whether or not the study's featured in a review. It's not essential that it does, but the fact that it has done is incredibly reassuring. That suggests that we really are here on the right line. Well done, us. Okay, so the first question was, is Schnall et al. 2008 to be considered as evidence? And the answer to that question, I think, is overwhelmingly yes. It really has 3 ticks there. Overwhelmingly yes. But we can't stop there. Just because we have something which is genuinely evidence doesn't mean that we should accept the hypothesis. We have to go on and ask a second question. And the second question is, does this evidence that we have provide us with a sufficient reason to accept that the hypothesis is true? And just here I think we run into a problem. And the problem is this. Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues formulated the hypothesis and defended it after the evidence that they are citing was published. So their method is post hoc. What they've done is formulated a hypothesis, generated a prediction, and then seen that existing research actually supports that prediction. And I think epistemically, that's not quite the position that we want to be in. The ideal position for us would be a different position. We would have a hypothesis and we would generate a novel prediction, one which had not yet been tested and one which seemed quite risky. And then we would go and test that prediction. Now in that situation, I might be inclined to say, we're getting close to having sufficient evidence to accept the hypothesis. I might want to see more than one prediction tested, or I might want to see several tests of the same prediction, but I think I'd be okay there. But the post hoc method, I think, is not a reliable one. The post hoc method, I think, is not a reliable one. I think that a philosopher can come up with a whole range of different hypotheses retrospectively. That's to say, hypotheses which generate predictions which appear to be borne out by existing studies. Indeed, I would say to you that for almost any set of existing studies you can find, a philosopher will be able to come up with a hypothesis different from one anyone has thought of before, but which is consistent with, makes predictions which are consistent with the findings of all of those studies. But that doesn't tell me that I've got any good reason to accept the hypothesis that the philosopher has proposed. Okay, so here I think we're in a tricky situation. The question was, is confirmation, is the evidence really sufficient to cause us to accept the hypothesis? Yes, the evidence supports the prediction, but the prediction doesn't support the hypothesis strongly enough because it's post hoc for us to accept the hypothesis. My view, therefore, is that we need more evidence before we should accept the hypothesis. I'm leaving this orange and not turning it red because I don't think there's anything wrong. I don't think we've got reason to reject the hypothesis. It's just that we don't have sufficient reason to accept it. It's not really very strong to give us some post hoc argument for it. Now, as this is the first time that we're evaluating a hypothesis, I just want to lay out the procedure that we followed. This is also in the notes below as well. The first thing is to never trust a philosopher. Do not trust a philosopher. That's right, that includes me. I'm a philosopher. Don't trust me. Why is that? Philosophers say all kinds of things about evidence, but often what they have done is gone and read some stuff and sought out some things that appear to support their own views. Philosophers like to find evidence for their own views, and what they often haven't done is very carefully sort out all of the evidence that opposes their views. And when they do find opposing evidence, they often offer quite implausible ways to explain away the opposing evidence. So don't trust a philosopher. Do the evaluation for yourself. Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues 2010 say, here's some evidence for our hypothesis, but it's up to you and me to evaluate that evidence for ourselves, not to trust them, because they're philosophers. We don't trust them at all. The second thing is to ask whether the putative evidence is genuinely evidence. And I've suggested there are 3 questions to work through here. Not that you have to answer yes to all questions in order for it to be genuine evidence, but this is a kind of guide to help you. Right? There isn't really an algorithm for this. It's more of an art, of course, than something that you could mechanize. But I think these questions provide useful guidance. Once you've done that, you then come to the question, is that evidence sufficient to justify accepting the hypothesis? And as you have just seen, you can have something which is very clearly evidence, which is really first-class evidence, but nevertheless, that isn't sufficient for you to accept the hypothesis being proposed. Some degree of holding off is still called for there. So where are we? Before we accept the hypothesis that the effect heuristic explains moral intuitions, it seems to me that we need a better argument than any we have yet seen in these lectures.